Good afternoon. I'm Dawson Carr, the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's exhibition to illuminate our current exhibition, Quest for Beauty, the Architecture, Landscapes, and Collections of John Yeon. This afternoon, we hear from the man who knew John Yeon best, his companion for over 30 years, Richard Louis Brown. Richard, in 1993, on the death of John Yeon, Richard inherited the Watzek house, the Shire, and most of Yeon's collections. And he set out with singular purpose to preserve Yeon's legacy. He founded the Yeon Center for Architecture and the Landscape at the University of Oregon to help preserve the Watzek house, where he lived for 37 years, and also the Shire. And he has been very much a part of the organization of this exhibition, and he is by far its most generous lender. Richard Brown was born and raised in Kansas City. And as a child, he attended classes at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. He went on to get a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and then was drafted. And fortunately for him, he served the Fifth Army at their headquarters in Chicago, so he was able to attend night classes at the Art Institute. Following his years of service, he became the art editor and critic of the Kansas City Star. And it was in that capacity that in the early 1960s, he met John Yeon, who had come to Kansas City to design galleries for the Nelson Atkins. Now, just before Richard's 30th birthday, he left the newspaper, deciding that he wanted to spend a period of time traveling and to try his hand at writing fiction. And after a long period exploring Japan and Taiwan, he spent most of the year 1966 on a tiny, uninhabited island off the coast of New Zealand. Totally alone, without a radio, telephone, anything like that. He did have a kerosene stove and a lantern and some fishing gear, and, significantly, his Olympic portable typewriter. And it was there that he drafted his first novel. After 9 months, a typhoon destroyed his shelter, and so he was forced to put out a white signal, and a passing fishing boat picked him up and took him back to civilization. For his next writing project, John Yeon invited him to one of his beach houses at Cannon Beach, and that began their relationship in early 1967. They soon became close companions, spending time in San Francisco. And then, on the death of Aubrey Watson in 1973, John Yeon bought the Watzek house to protect it from threatened changes, and Richard agreed to live in it. I should mention that Richard has served on our board of trustees for 24 years, and during that time served on numerous committees of the board, but none more significantly than the Collections Committee. This is the committee that decides what we acquire, and so it has tremendous importance in an art museum. He also served on the Collections Committee at the Seattle Art Museum for a number of years, and he was chairman on 2 occasions for long stints of our Collections Committee. He received the Governor's Arts Award for 2004 and 2005 for his patronage of the arts, and it has not just been this institution. He has also served on the boards of the Portland Center Stage, the Oregon Council for the Humanities, the Friends of Chamber Music, the PSU Foundation, among others. He has been very generous to this institution and to the Seattle Art Institution with numerous gifts of art from his own collection and the collections of John Yeon. And this is, of course, one of the best ways that he has preserved Yeon's legacy in the Pacific Northwest. He's a serious amateur pianist and lives today with his husband, Tom Mark, and stays involved in the museum because he believes profoundly in the value of preserving marvelous works of art and making them available to the public. Would you please join me in welcoming Richard Lewis Brown?
Thank you, Dawson. I'm afraid you've stolen some of my script, but you may get some of that twice. John Yeon said he didn't want to be famous, and for the most part, he got his wish. He was a brilliant architect, but he deliberately avoided the complications of a big architectural practice. He often worked alone as an artist or with a single draftsman. He wielded profound influence on planning, parks, and scenic preservation in the Northwest, but he was most comfortable behind the scenes, writing tightly reasoned and literate arguments. Still, he had confidence in his own accomplishments, and I think he would have been pleased by the present exhibition and the focus on his legacy. It's been a long time coming. It's been 23 years since John died. Now, all at once, we have a splendid exhibition and also 3 new books about his life and work. I'm deeply grateful to Brian Friso for initiating the exhibition, to the museum staff for installing it so beautifully, and especially to Randy Gregg, who's been writing and raising awareness of John's work and influence for the past 23 years. I congratulate Randy on his role as guest curator and heartily recommend his book about John's architecture, and this one about John's landscape and conservation achievements. Meanwhile, the distinguished architectural historian Mark Tribe has written a comprehensive and authoritative book about John, and funding is presently being sought for a publication of a 4th book by architect John Cava, an eloquent appreciation of John's houses, both built and unbuilt. Add to that Randy's truly essential lecture last month, and 2017 definitely is the year of Yeon. What could be left that hasn't already been said? If you came today expecting first-time revelations, titillating private details, some name dropping, or hints of controversy, well, I'll see what I can do. What follows would be sort of a free association recollection and gossip, but what I hope comes through is how deeply John cared and how very hard he worked, whether in his architecture, where no detail was too small to sweat, or in his preservation work, where he thought hard and wrote convincingly. I vise and revise, he wrote, toil and sweat, and people say, ah, yes, how right you are, and good for you, and of course nothing happens at all. Things did happen, of course. But first, the basics. John Yeon was born in Portland in 1910, 106 years ago. He was a born architect and a born collector. I'm often asked about the origins of the names Yeon and Mock. The Mock was the family name on John's mother's side. Some people guess that Yeon is a Korean name, but in this case, Yeon is not Asian, it's French-Canadian. John's father, John Baptiste Yeon II, was born in 1865 in Plantagenet, Ontario, a small logging community in eastern Ontario near the St. Lawrence River. Dozens of Yeons show up in the Canadian census records of the second half of the 19th century, with first names like Pierre and Jean and Baptiste. The elder Yeon came to this country from Canada when he was 17. He found work for minimal wages in lumber camps, first in Ohio, then in Cathlamet, Washington. Eventually, he earned enough to buy a team of 12 oxen and devised an improved method of bringing logs out of the forest. By 1906, he had 250 men in his employ and was prosperous enough to leave the timber industry behind and move to Portland, where he became a prominent businessman. Yeon Avenue, Yeon Building, and John Yeon State Park are all named for him, that is, the architect's father. He was a major force in the building of the scenic Columbia River Highway, as is memorably documented in the exhibition. This is a snapshot of John at the Vista House. As you see, it's before the lanterns were completed. His father brought a heavy French accent with him from Canada, and John Riley recalled his father proudly introducing him as Jean-Baptiste Yeon de Turd. Letters from father to son began, Mon cher Jean-Baptiste. John's mother's name was Elizabeth Mock, as in Mock's Crest and Mock's Bottom in North Portland. John's maternal great-grandfather was Heinrich Macke, M-A-C-K-E, born in 1793 in Steinfeld, Germany. He married in Germany and in 1833 immigrated to the United States with his new wife. They settled first in Pennsylvania, where Macke became a naturalized citizen in 1843, changing his name from Macke to Henry Mock, M-O-C-K. Subsequently, the young family moved to northern Missouri, where they farmed until they struggled over the Oregon Trail in a covered wagon and arrived in Portland in October 1852. John Mock, the architect's maternal grandfather, was 13 when the family made its journey to Oregon. The area of their land grant still bears the Mock name and includes land that is now the University of Portland campus. Actually, John's grandfather gave the land for a Methodist college, but somehow it ended up a Catholic university. One of John's early memories was of living in a far grander house than his mates, and of being driven to school with his sister in a horse-drawn cart, a day after day after day ordeal that was for him excruciating. He mentioned this often enough that it was clear it had an indelible effect on him and may help explain, at least in part, his increasingly quirky attitude toward wealth, or the appearance of wealth, in later life. A newspaper clipping in my files recounts an occasion in 1920 when Yeon Père chartered a Curtiss airplane to fly John and his sister Pauline from the city over to their home on Willamette Boulevard. This is the Yeon home. The article says, 3 minutes later, the machine bearing Mr. Yeon and his 2 children swooped down on a large field adjoining Mr. Yeon's home on Willamette Boulevard. And after lunch, they flew back with a detour to circle around the Yeon building, then the tallest building in Oregon. Bear in mind that this was just 17 years after the first flight of Kitty Hawk. The family had a house on the boardwalk in Seaside. Oh, there's the airplane. John's the one peeking over the edge. The family had a house on the boardwalk at Seaside, But by the time John was 13, he opted to forego summers by the sea in order to serve as office boy, first in the A.E. Doyle architectural office and then with Herman Brookman, where at age 15, he designed this house for a client. I'm sure it was designed as an exercise, but for a client named Dr. Frank Kistner. It's interesting to note that while Dr. Kistner decided at that point to build a house by Wade pipes instead, 20 years later, Dr. Kistner's daughter, Anne, and her husband, Lawrence Shaw, went to John to design their house. The Shaw House, 1950, turned out to be John's only completed house in what he later called his palace style. To make a man of him, John said, his father sent him to Culver Military Academy, where, ironically, he distinguished himself at horseback riding, drawing, and writing poetry. Though he did well, he hated Culver, and to avoid going back, he applied for early admission to Stanford University. For his 13th birthday, John's father wrote him a letter exhorting him, quote, "Equip yourself with an education that will pilot you through your life, making it possible to fight your battles without being handicapped for the lack of education like many have done and are doing," an apparent reference to himself, since he had not gone beyond high school. Nevertheless, he had achieved wealth and remarkable influence, and his example, it turned out, was more persuasive than his advice. Young John was granted early admission to Stanford and began there in the fall of 1928, but he attended less than one semester. His father died suddenly at age 63, from eating too many figs, John insisted, in October 1928, just 2 weeks before John's 18th birthday. John chartered a plane and flew back to Oregon, landing on the beach at Seaside, and freed from his father's ambitions, he never went back. He said, "I didn't graduate from anything. I didn't graduate from grammar school, from high school, or from college. I did graduate from Sunday school." From that point on, he was almost entirely self-taught, and I'd say he had a pretty good teacher. He became erudite, urbane, courtly, and in his wry, self-effacing way, magnetic. After the elder Yeon's death, Julius Meyer, who had been a close friend of his father, got John a job with a New York firm that was then remodeling the Meyer and Frank store here. Thus, at 18, John found himself at large in the great metropolis. He enrolled in night classes at Columbia, but he found the studies boring and the city's other attractions irresistible. That lasted most of a year until his mother, becoming suspicious, insisted that he come home. The earliest art purchase that's in his inventory was from that first New York period. It's a large, signed lithograph of a mother and child by Picasso, which he bought from a respectable New York dealer. He was 19. Later in life, he actually didn't like it very much, and it turns out he was right. It's now considered to be one of a well-known group of fakes. Fortunately, he didn't make many such mistakes, and over time he developed an incredible eye for the rare, the unique, and the beautiful object. At age 21, he bought Chapman Point to save it from development. At the time, he intended to own it only until the state could buy it, as an addition to the then new Ecola State Park. But his attachment to it, his ownership, protecting and preserving it, became a lifelong obsession. Ownership or possession is a recurrent theme in John's story. Ownership of landscapes and buildings and art objects. Chapman Point and the Shire, the Watzek House, the Jorgensen House, and at least 1,000 objects. At 22, he bought a Sung Dynasty painting. In his Smithsonian oral history interview, he said, quote, "People sometimes ask me why I got interested in Asian art. That's quite easy to explain. It's because I knew the Columbia Gorge very well, and when I first saw Chinese painting, which had crags and twisted trees and tall vertical waterfalls, it was not at all strange. I just walked right into the painting." He organized the first exhibition of Chinese art in the Portland Art Museum, and he was instrumental in the acquisition of several objects that are mainstays of the museum's Asian collection to this day, including the Indian bronze statue of Shiva that's currently included in the exhibition. As a member of the museum board and of the collection committee, he advocated for purchase of the Shiva and wrote to a friend, quote, "I told Jim Baldwin," he was a distinguished scholar of Indian bronzes, "that the single object I coveted most in the world was a good Shiva. I would have sold my house and lived in a tent if I could have shared it with this one." He went on to say that he couldn't possibly afford it. John served as a board member of the museum and eventually designed and installed several galleries here, such as a gallery of Greek and Roman material, the original installation of the Kress Foundation gifts, and Marjorie Hoffman Smith galleries for Asian art. All have long since disappeared. Now, as Dawson previewed for you, John and I met in Kansas City, and I was the art editor of the Kansas City Star. One of my main responsibilities was to cover the Nelson Atkins Museum, then known as the Nelson Gallery. It's one of the great sleeper museums of the world, with a superb collection, especially strong in Chinese art and in decorative arts. The director at the time was Lawrence Sigmund, widely regarded as a leading scholar of Chinese art and one of the last of the great scholar directors of a major museum. By the late 1950s, John had grown weary of designing and building houses. Several plans that he had high hopes for failed to get built for one reason or another, and he turned his designing attention more toward museum installations. He was engaged to design a series of galleries at the Nelson Atkins, the first for a collection of English miniatures. That was in 1963. Larry Sigmund introduced me to John at the opening party. Fortunately, I'd written a favorable comment about the design. He returned to Kansas City the same year to design and install a gallery of Chinese furniture, and we became acquainted. I left the newspaper, as Dawson told you, before my 30th birthday to travel and write a novel. And when I got back, John was again in Kansas City, and prompted by Larry Sigmund, he invited me to use one of his little houses at Cannon Beach. I accepted, and we soon began a relationship that lasted for nearly 30 years until his death at the age of 83. Now, after he came back from his teenage New York adventure, he designed a splendid house for his mother. Understandably, since he was 19 and had not yet built one, she decided to buy an existing house at the head of King Avenue. But she allowed him to remodel it and to design an extensive garden. Meanwhile, Governor Julius Meyer appointed him to the State Parks Advisory Board, where he met Aubrey Watson, who owned a timber business. He learned that Watzek was interested in building a house. So John scouted out a site, made a site plan, designed a house, and built a model, all on his own, which he then showed to Watzek. But since he had no architectural schooling and little experience, he advised Watzek to go to an established architect to have a house designed, which Watzek did twice. But in the end, he came back to John's design, and that's what was built. John was 26. As I'm sure you know by now, shortly after the house was completed, a photograph with Mount Hood in the background was exhibited by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The house was included in both the MoMA 10th and 15th anniversary exhibitions. The Watzek House became famous and launched John as a brilliant new architectural talent. With the sudden fame of the Watzek House and its connection with the Museum of Modern Art, John developed an impressive circle of New York friends. Among many others, Lincoln Kirstein, Philip Johnson, Alfred Barr, the founding director of Museum of Modern Art, and especially Barr's wife, Daisy, and the curator of architecture, John McAndrew. It was through McAndrew that John was invited to be a guest at Frank Lloyd Wright's home and compound Taliesin. Afterward, McAndrew reported that Wright had said of John, "That young man has spiritual meat on his bones." Mrs. Wright was particularly taken with him. Philip Johnson, the architect of the Glass House fame, was a rather peppery character, very different from John, but they became good friends. And 20 years later, Philip came to the West Coast to give a lecture. It was the fall of 1962, and spent a few days with John. They went to the beach, and as it happened, rode out the wild and catastrophic Columbus Day storm in John's little cottage known as the Tree House. It was by far the most famous storm in Oregon history. They drove back to Portland the next day through scenes of incredible devastation. That visit was the first time Johnson had been inside the Watzek house. He later wrote that the house was much better than the photographs. Everybody should see it. John and I had several visits with Johnson in later years, both in Portland and on the East Coast. We were invited to lunch twice at the Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. And once we went to his office in the Sigmund building before going to lunch together in town. And John, who took stereo slides, had brought his viewer and a few slides of the Shire, which he proposed to show to Philip. Wearing his trademark raccoon glasses, he squinted at 2 or 3 slides and then said, "John, you know I can't stand nature." John admired the Glass House and the interiors of the Seagram building, but he hated Johnson's museum at Dunbarton Oaks and simply rolled his eyes at Johnson's forays into postmodernism. John's search for beauty was all about the visual. His passion for preserving landscapes was largely about protecting vistas. He was drawn to visual arts, especially 3-dimensional objects, and by far his favorite performing art was ballet. He liked the music well enough, but the attraction was in the sets and costumes, and above all, the beautiful young bodies moving through space with apparent joy and perfect balance. He cheerfully described himself as a scopophile. It was his discovery of the ballet in New York that eventually led to his friendship with Lincoln Kirstein, founder of the New York City Ballet, and to his acquaintance with the photographer George Flatlines, who was the leading photographer for ballet. He took a series of photos of John in a hammock. The first one looks a bit preppy and out of place, right? Then he gets into the swing of it, so to speak. There's one more, but I think we'll stop here. With the sitter unnamed, this image was published far and wide. I was planning to show it to you for the very first time anywhere with the sitter named, but Randy Gregg not only flashed a bootleg copy of it on the screen during his lecture last month. This is the real thing. John described the circumstances in a V-mail letter to Daisy Barr sent from North Africa during World War II. I went to Lines' studio only once to go out to lunch with him, and he had just bought a hammock and wanted to try it out to see how it would work as a prop for later models. I obliged quite readily, and he snapped a couple. Then he wanted to see how it would work for possible future nudes. So I obliged again and flopped around in the hammock's commodious folds while his gal assistant adjusted lights and he snapped some more. It was amusing at the time, but I've lived to regret it. To explain, John was good friends with William Worcester, the esteemed California architect, and his wife Casey. In fact, John was best man at their wedding. The letter continued. This is the letter to Daisy Barr from Africa. The last time I saw Casey, her first words were that she had just seen a picture of me in PM in a hammock. Now, PM was an afternoon daily newspaper that was very popular in New York during the 1940s. The letter continues, I could only think that it was Lines' favorite, a sort of moon June tune thing. Respectable, except for this, I had no clothes on. All during our visit, I could only think that I had appeared in PM naked, had all the sensations of dreaming you're on a streetcar in your underwear. But as I saw Casey to her hotel, she gave me the paper, and it was a picture with clothes. But by then, the visit had been ruined. Now, truth be known, he was secretly quite proud of this photo. It was published several times without identifying the sitter and became one of Lines' best-known images. A few years ago, long after John died, the photo was used to illustrate an article about Lines in Art in America. So back to the Watzek house. Once he had decided on John's design, Watzek urged John to take a job in the A.E. Doyle architectural office to produce the working drawings and to have the benefit of engineers for the mechanical systems. John agreed with hesitation. It turned out to be an uncomfortable arrangement for him, and he stayed only 5 months, long enough to complete the working drawings and begin construction. From then on, he spent every working hour on the site, overseeing every detail. When construction was complete, the Doyle office had photographs taken and began showing the house as the work of A.E. Doyle and Associates. This photograph by Boychuk, unidentified, was included in a group that the office gave to the critic and historian Henry Russell Hitchcock, who in turn showed this group of photographs to the architecture department at the Museum of Modern Art. This was all unbeknownst to John. A.E. Doyle had died 9 years earlier, and Pietro Beluschi was in charge of the office. John and Pietro, who was 11 years older, were good friends, but a disagreement over credit for the design of the Watzek house put a strain on their friendship. Unlike John, Beluschi was an excellent promoter, and he was understandably eager to gain publicity for the Doyle office. Unfortunately, some articles about the house credited it simply as the work of the Doyle office. John told me that one headline in a publication said, "The Watzek house showed evidence of Beluschi's fine Italian hand." And John said Beluschi's fine Italian hand didn't bother to correct it. The Museum of Modern Art gave the credit as A.E. Doyle and Associates, architect, John Yeon, designer, which was acceptable. But other publications got it mixed up, to John's distress. Repeatedly, editors asked for clarification, and at one point, Beluschi, in rather obvious pique, wrote that the credit should read, A.E. Doyle and Associates architect, John Yeon, collaborator. Well, I ask you, the country was in the middle of a war, and collaborator was about as nasty a word as could be found. Aubrey Watson tried to stay out of the muddle, but eventually he wrote to an editor and said that Yeon was the designer of all the visible aspects of the house and gardens and should be given full credit. It's not hard to see both sides of this misunderstanding. In her book about Belusky, Meredith Clausen gives a rather harsh and disapproving view of Belusky's actions. I can see both sides. You would think that once Watzek had weighed in on the issue, it would have gone away. But while Belusky was here at home building his rapidly growing reputation, John was stuck over in North Africa in a backwater of World War II, designing barracks and outhouses for the Army engineers by day and by night, obsessing about being denied clear credit for the design of his major opus. Moving on and moving up, Belusky conceded the point. But even 20 years later, when I came into John's life, it was still a sore point for him. Gradually, though, he grew philosophical about it, and the two old friends became friends once more. They died within a month of each other. Aubrey Watson lived in the house John designed for him from its completion in late 1937 until his death in 1973 at age 84. The house was put up for sale. John and I latched on to a rumor that it was about to be sold to a family with 4 teenagers and 4 dogs and a plan to dig a swimming pool in the courtyard. And of course, we couldn't let that happen. The story wasn't all true, but it served as a convenient excuse for buying the house to save it from such a sorry fate. John wanted to protect it, but he had no wish to live there. His much more modest house in the woods, which he dubbed Dogpatch, it was actually his 1939 Jorgensen house, which he had bought from the original clients in 1945, served him as both residence and studio and better suited his unpretentious personal style. Although I was happily ensconced in the San Francisco apartment, I agreed to move to Portland to live in the Watzek house. John continued to live at Dogpatch, but he spent time at the Watzek house almost every day, and we both took enormous pleasure in rotating objects from the collection, many of them long hidden away in storage throughout the rooms. I lived there from the fall of 1973 until June of 2010, 37 years, even 1 year more than Watzek did. The house turns 80 this year. For an octogenarian house built of wood, it's held up pretty well. It still has almost all of its original interior finishes and fixtures, including the linoleum floor in the kitchen, and intact 1930s bathrooms, subtly gold-tinted window glass, and the first instance of John Yeon blue in the guest bedroom. Lavish paneling of unfinished noble fir, western hemlock, and white oak shows a warm patina. The exterior of Douglas fir has weathered to a handsome silvery color as intended. The original wisteria still produces spectacular cascades of white over the reflecting pool each spring. Over the years, the house has had 3 roofs and is due for a new one. A more difficult fix than you might think, since the cedar shingles are stacked twice as thick as normal, that is 2.5 inches to the weather rather than the usual 5. And this gives a fine texture to the sculpturally dynamic roof and allows the edges to be trimmed on an angle parallel to the sloping fascia that hides the copper gutters for a clean and elegant profile. So what's it like to live in a John Yeon house? I've now lived exactly 50 continuous years in Yeon-designed dwellings, 6 years in the San Francisco apartment, 37 years in the Watzek house, and now 7 years in the Jorgensen house. At nearly 5,000 square feet, the Watzek house was certainly more space than necessary for one person. Yet I never felt lost in it, always felt embraced by the warmth of the materials and the comfort of those proportions. I still get great pleasure in contemplating the many details that are so carefully worked out with no element unresolved. Although we lived quietly, there were some great parties. In summer, I serve cocktails on the front terrace and dinner in the courtyard at tables dressed to coordinate with the flower beds. Summer parties were usually for about 24, sometimes as many as 32. In winter, for large parties, tables were set in the library, the guest room, and the dining room. One of John's favorite occasions was a program of chamber music played by a trio of friends with me at the forte piano. Both the Watzek House and Dogpatch have a deep sense of privacy, peaceful retreats from the noise and hubbub of the city. The house at Dogpatch is threaded through the existing trees. There were mature trees on the property, and John oriented the house and the covered walkway that goes up from the garage through these trees and actually cut out a space around one of the trees cut out from the pergola roof. Dogpatch is not a big party house. 8's the limit at the magic table. I refer to the magic table because it's actually a counter in the kitchen which, when a panel is raised, can be slid out into the living room in front of a built-in banquette, and it becomes the dining table. And then we set the table first in the kitchen, slide it out, and when dinner is over, there's no need to clear the table, you just make it go away. John said the real test of his houses was whether they gave pleasure to the owners. As it happened, with the exception of the Jorgensen house and the de Canizares house, the original owners of all of John's major houses stayed for as long as they lived. It is safe to say that whatever else he achieved, he was supremely successful at giving comfort and pleasure to those lucky enough to live in his houses. After the triumph of the Watzek house, John went on to build other wonderful houses to make an indelible mark as a preserver of landscapes and historic buildings, as an advocate for parks and activist on issues of city planning, highway design, and in particular, protection of the Columbia River Gorge. When World War II was over, the Jorgensens decided to live elsewhere, and John bought their house in 1945 and dubbed it, as I mentioned, Dogpatch, because it was on Dogwood Lane, and perhaps because he had had a succession of small poodles, Sebastian and Tinkerbell in my acquaintance. By the time I knew the dogs, they were his last pair. In 1968, they were quite old and getting bald. They had been white, but had gone sort of pinkish. One day, the four of us took a trail through Oswald West State Park to the short sand beach. The trail generally follows a small stream, and at one point, the female seemed to disappear. Anxiously, we turned back looking for her. John was calling, "Tinkerbell, Tinkerbell." A smart aleck popped up in the bushes saying, "Here I am." But I digress. The exhibition vividly portrays John Yeon the architect, John Yeon the preservationist, and John Yeon the collector. There were a few other John Yeons. There was John Yeon the designer, and you may have seen a couple of pieces of his furniture in the exhibition. And I was going to show you an outdoor lantern that he designed using a glass fishing float he designed the bronze fitting for it, and an outdoor wall light made with a battery fluid bottle, and the bronze chandelier in the Watzek House dining room, other lighting fixtures, and a desk chair that sits in front of the combination desk and phonograph cabinet at the Jorgensen house. There could be many more examples of his design work. Then there was John Yeon, the craftsman. He made sturdy, stylish planter pots for the Watzek house. And he had a pair of Sung Dynasty dingware dishes, shallow dishes with white glaze from the Sung Dynasty. One of them had a stand that fit precisely. The other didn't. His solution? He carved one himself. And I was going to ask you if you could tell the difference, which one he made. And there are also Messonnier candlesticks in the exhibition. One was missing its top-knot wax cup. John formed a replacement in wax and had it cast in bronze. Then he had it gold-plated, using the gold from fillings pried out of his teeth when he had some capped. Again, I can't tell which one it was without taking him out and looking at the bottom. He taught himself to do traditional gold leafing with buhl and rabbit skin glue. When the Fagan Galleries in San Francisco opened at the Legion of Honor, he designed those galleries, and it was a large three-space gallery with a gold bead around the ceiling. And the contractors couldn't find anybody to make it properly, so John and I gold leafed the entire thing. That in the San Francisco apartment, there were window surrounds that John marbleized himself, and the entryway was also marbleized by his own hand. Then we have John Yeon, the inventor. A lot has been said about the ventilation system in the plywood houses, separating the view function from the ventilating function of the windows. But here's one of my favorites. He devised a system for turning valuable vases into lamp bases without drilling them for wiring, which of course would devalue them as art objects. His solution: start with a coffee can, fill with cement, attach a lamp fixture and cut a metal disc precisely to the size and shape of the jar's neck. So you could simply lower the heavy coffee can into the lamp. It rests on the neck of the jar, and voila, a precious art object turned into a utilitarian object, and no harm done. Then there was John Yeon, the photographer. For a time, he was a heavy smoker. He said he never smoked more than a carton a day. Then he quit cold turkey. Since the Jorgensen house had been built for a photographer, it had a darkroom in the basement. John bought a 4x5 camera and undertook to make studio photos of every object in his collection. He spent hours setting up the lighting, taking the photos, and developing, enlarging, and printing them far into the night, all to keep his hands busy and avoid a relapse into smoking. He said quitting smoking was the hardest thing he ever did. Health benefits aside, it produced an elegant photo catalog of his collection, all entered into binders according to a card file system which he had worked out. Well, the conceit of other Yeons could go on, but there was one more I wanted to show you. It's John Yeon as art restorer. It's tricky because professional conservators take a very dim view of what they consider to be amateur mucking around with art objects. I submit that John was much more than a dabbler. He did his research, and he had unlimited patience for the niggling, particular work of patching up historic stuff. It's hard to illustrate most of his restoration projects, but I was going to show you an Italian painted chest of which I have before and after photographs, and it was really beat up. And he undertook to fill in the missing painting, and it had intricately painted scenes on it. He filled those all in seamlessly, and it happened that I sold that at Christies auction in 2010. The auction catalog clearly stated that it had been restored. Nevertheless, it sold quite well indeed. John once wrote, "I once said that you had to start buying something before you really wised up about it. Now I say you have to repair a thing before you really, really wise up and fall in love all over again." In the course of the days and years as they passed, all of those pursuits seemed to fit into the normal course of things. But when I look back now, I marvel. Indeed, I'm astonished that he was able to do all of this and still devote most of the day to the endeavors that he considered his real life's work. That is, architecture when he had a project, and the writing of treatises on whatever conservation, planning, or preservation issue he was fired up about at the time. John had many remarkable talents, but one talent he didn't have was for self-promotion, or as he put it more bluntly, had no talent for making money. From the beginning, he saw architecture as an art and had no desire to have a large architectural office. Consequently, it's often been assumed that he was rich and simply didn't need to work, which wasn't exactly true. The family continued to have income from his father's business interests after the elder Yeon's death, but John's share was relatively modest. Although he assembled an impressive and eventually amazingly valuable art collection, he actually spent little money on it. The most he ever spent for a single object was $5,500, and that was actually for two objects, a pair of Italian Rococo stucco plaques that are in the exhibition. It was one of his later purchases. He often said, "It's not the things you buy you regret, it's the things you don't buy." In 1965, he wrote to Larry Sigmund, quote, "I wince with pain every time I think of that pair of Kakiemon jars I didn't get. I shouldn't even think of such things because of all the dough that is going into such things as pipes and tar paper and sewer connections and garages at the beach and the Shire. Sordid necessities. I tell myself quite often that my collecting days are over, and indeed they probably are." He continues, "I've been buying way beyond my regular means by cashing in life insurance I didn't need and odds and ends of stocks and bonds I inherited. And when I reinvested after the division of the family company, I just kept out some cash to invest in art, and have done so. This is not by way of complaint, for I've had a spree and enjoyed it, but I certainly can't go on collecting landscapes, houses, and a broad assortment of decorative arts." But to demonstrate how astute his purchases were, in 2009, I sold a group of 11 Chinese objects at Christies, including there's a pair of Chinese dishes with fish on them that John bought in 1959 for $12.50 each. And a pair of carved bamboo boxes that he bought in 1961 for $175. John bought a little flowery bowl that's just 4 inches across in Osaka for yen equaling $111.51. It arrived in Portland broken, literally in 2 pieces. His catalog card entry has this entry: broken in shipping from Japan, received $75 for break, wanted more. So if you subtract the $75, he actually paid $36 for it. The celadon in the picture was $40. So the photo that I was going to show represents an investment of $276.51. Well, are you ready for it? The $25 pair of fish plates sold for $362,500. The bamboo boxes sold for $482,500. The celadon dish for a piddling $11,000 plus. And the broken mille-fleur bowl with its $36 investment sold for, wait for it, $314,500. It alone brought more than John spent on collecting in his entire life. And no, it wasn't just a fluke. The point is that he had uncanny vision and an incredible eye for unique objects that are the best of their kind. Another point to be taken is that the art market is not a reliable measure of true aesthetic value. The little bowl was just as charming and loaded with history at $36 as it was at $300,000. Sometimes later in life, he could seem downright miserly. He bought quantities of the cheapest brick ice cream from Safeway, but only when it was on sale. He washed his own socks and underwear in the kitchen sink, and when he traveled by himself, not with me, mind you, he stayed in the cheapest, sometimes really dodgy hotels. He said, "I like grand hotels, but I don't like in-betweens." He was reluctant to go to expensive restaurants, too. After all, he said, fancy food tastes good, but by the next morning, it's all turned to shh. Well, you know. He was especially allergic to housekeepers. He said cleaning just wears things out. He read widely and took an amused interest in William Beckford, an 18th century English writer and art collector, builder of a spectacular folly called Beckford's Tower in Bath. John said that, like Beckford, his ambition was to walk down the street and have people say, "There goes that great eccentric." Well, John never came close, despite his occasionally tweedy apparel. In later life, he tended mostly toward mossy colors, what he called his protective coloration. Still, his manners were courtly, his bearing was distinguished, his eyes were penetrating, and his head proportionally large. His profile was classic. Like the Watzek house, he appeared taller than he actually was. He was quiet, but bore an air of compelling authority. His voice was soft, although he could make a fine noise if he needed to. Once we were hiking near Paradise Lodge on Mount Rainier. It was after Labor Day, but the snowmelt had been late, and there were multitudes of wildflowers and more than a few tourists. We were on a high trail and could look down on hikers far below. John spotted a group carelessly wandering and yelled, "Stay on the trail," in a voice that thundered and echoed like the voice of God. Hikers from miles around stopped dead in their tracks. Since the current exhibition opened, more than one architect has asked me how on earth someone with John's modernist sensibilities could like that Rococo stuff. My answer involves two words, both of which are out of fashion these days. The first is connoisseurship. He could appreciate Rococo because he had informed himself of design history and had trained his eye to see the difference between the good and the bad. He understood the level of skill and artistry required to achieve the fleet movement and carefree balance of the best Rococo design. The other word is taste, considered a bad word since the 1960s. I use taste in the sense of the ability to discern works of quality and combinations that are aesthetically appropriate. John's way of explaining his taste was that he liked to combine plain and fancy. To him, the Rococo object might perfectly complement a plain modernist wall, just as the carpet of lawn and startling bank of blue hydrangeas contrast the wild areas of the Shire. He said that it was as though the Baroque structure had been dipped in rum sauce and served flambé. The sea scroll is the most characteristic and easily identified motif of the Rococo style. This is from a lecture he gave here in the museum. It is the asymmetrical use that marks it as Rococo. It becomes an energetic little flourish, very full of bounce, that might lose its balance and fly off into space, except there's another sea scroll above or below, springing in another direction. In San Francisco, he had bought and rescued from a tragic state of dilapidation a little pre-earthquake building on Montgomery Street, just 2 blocks from Chinatown. It had no basement. John had one dug with chopsticks, he said. And I was going to show you a photo that incorporated objects from the collection that are on view upstairs, just to show how he combined them. Chinese objects might sit next to Japanese and Japanese next to Italian, but each object is given its own space and allowed to breathe. Mounted to the left, or rather mounted on axis with the entry to the apartment, was an architectural fragment, also in the exhibition, a door and its surround from the Carrezzonico in Venice, finished in lacca povera, which is literally poor lacquer, a technique developed in the 18th century in Italy to simulate Asian lacquer using paint and varnish instead of resin. The style is high Rococo and chinoiserie, imagining a Far Eastern fantasy land. Now, how in the world did John come to own a door from one of the most famous palaces on the Grand Canal in Venice? The Carrezzonico was built in the 1750s with decoration by John Domenico Tiepolo, who might or might not have had a hand in painting the door. The Rezzonico family lived there until the early 19th century. Then it had a succession of owners, and in 1832, the entire furnishings and collections of the palace were sold off. That could be when our door left the building, or it could have happened later, but in any case, eventually, the city of Venice bought the palace in 1935, and it was opened as a decorative arts museum in 1936. Today, it's one of the finest museums in Venice and prominently displays a door from the same suite as John's. At some point, the door, before John got it, the door was acquired by Adolf Lowy, a dealer in high-end European antiques. Lowy was a big, affable, canny businessman with extraordinary knowledge and taste. He was born in Munich to a family that owned a prominent antiques business. As a young man, he moved to Venice, where he opened his own business and soon was named German consul to Venice. He was Jewish, and so in 1939 he had to flee Europe, and eventually settled in Los Angeles, where he opened a gallery in a big house on La Cienega. Soon after, the LA County Museum mounted an exhibition of his Venetian furniture. John happened to see the exhibition and had a sort of epiphany. That's when he discovered Rococo. And Lowy had Rococo, did he ever? He sold to all of the major museums, and John became a steady customer. He said he was like a moth around the flame. His first purchase was in 1941, and from then on, John steeped himself in the knowledge of 18th century design. Now, you've perhaps seen photographs, or if you've been to Seattle, you've seen an Italian room that was installed in the apartment in San Francisco. It was the dining room. And it dates from about 1575. The room had been installed in Lowy's gallery in Venice and then in his building in Los Angeles, where John saw it. Dame Judith Anderson, the actress, bought it as a gift for her husband, but they had a falling out before the room could be dismantled and shipped to her. John lusted for it, but he didn't have the $4,500 in his pocket, so he persuaded his brother, Norman, to put up the money. John went to LA to supervise the dismantling and had it shipped to his house in Portland, where he stored it, a considerable pile of lumber, he said, not long after he paid off his brother. And while he was restoring the San Francisco building, he realized that the window openings corresponded to windows in the back of the building that looked out on storied Gold Street. So he installed the room He called it a crooked room from a crooked building on a crooked street, and built the apartment around it. I lived there from 1967 to 1973 and served many dinners in that room. It's now installed in the Seattle Art Museum. They've done a wonderful job of installing it there. Well, I'll go on a little bit about that. There could be an entire lecture about the room. But suffice it to say that a few years after John died, I sold the San Francisco building and had the room removed. For some years, it was stored in a climate-controlled warehouse out by the airport, once again reduced to a pile of lumber. I hoped to give it to this museum, but it was turned down by a consulting curator long since departed. So I gave it to Seattle Art Museum, and as I say, it was a great outcome. Julie Emerson, the curator of decorative arts up there, did a wonderful job of researching and installing the room. In the exhibition, you see some candlesticks that were among John's most treasured possessions. They're ormolu, that is, fire-gilded bronze, designed by Just-Aurel Messonnier, who was one of the most important tastemakers of the Rococo age. John bought them from an auction at Sotheby's, London. There's a similar pair in the Wallace collection in London and a single candlestick of that design in the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's a story I like to tell about them, and if you've heard it before, just indulge me. Shortly after John died, I got a letter from the curator of the collection of Sir Edmund Rothschild. Sir Edmund Rothschild, it seemed, wanted those candlesticks. The curator wrote, quote, "Sir Edmund already owns one pair, but he thinks it would be nice to have 2 pairs. I was able to write back and say, it is nice to have 2 pairs. John acquired the second pair at a later auction. Poor Sir Edmund, he died a few years ago with only 2 Messonnier candlesticks to his name. To sum up the Rococo issue, John once said, good Rococo decoration is, quote, laughter in visible form. Now, how can you resist that? John went to Europe as a teenager with a YMCA tour and went back 2 years later with his mother and his brother Norman. When I met him, he'd traveled to Mexico and Japan, but he hadn't been back to Europe in 30 years. He had never been to Rome. So for his 60th birthday, I gave him a trip to Rome and planned a 2-month sort of glorified road trip. We drove north from Rome, spent a week in Siena, toured the hill towns of Tuscany and Umbria, seeking out every mural by the Renaissance painter Benozzo Gozzoli. And in Todi, we happened upon a large antiques dealer fair where we both fell for a pair of 18th century Venetian mirrors with an amusing mask design. We kept thinking about them as we drove on. Now, Sir Kenneth Clark had a new book out just then in which he had declared the Ducal Palace at Urbino to be the most beautiful house in the world, which prompted John to declare the Amalienburg at Charlottenburg, outside of Munich, as his most beautiful house in the world. Of course, he'd never been there. So we saw Urbino and Ravenna, and when we got to Venice, we checked into the gritty palace, not one of his other choices, and strolled out to see the neighborhood. Just around the first corner, what should we come upon, blowing cheeky kisses at us, but those mirrors from Todi, this mask and the lips pursed out. It seemed like fate. We bought the mirrors, and for many years they were a feature of the Watzek House dining room. We looked at Palladian villas near Venice. Eventually we ended up in Munich, where we toured the glorious Baroque churches in the area, and as a kind of grand finale, we went to see the Amalienburg, John's candidate for most beautiful house in the world, which he had never seen. In a letter to his friend Sigmund, he wrote, quote, after being at the Amalienburg on a sunny day, and there in the morning, the main rooms faced east. And no one else around for about an hour. I had such a raging lust for silver Rococo that I had to possess a sprig of it, so I did, for price. It's a severely simple rectangular mirror that goes berserk at the top. It's by Nahl, N-A-H-L, who worked at Potsdam. I knew nothing about Nahl at the time. Now I'm a Nahl scholar, and you might say an authority on Potsdam Rococo. It's the best. That John could so confidently declare his affection for a house he'd never seen was surprising to me, but it actually wasn't unusual for him. For years, he had told me his favorite painter in the world was Caspar David Friedrich, the early 19th century German uber-romantic painter, whose works often portray contemplative figures silhouetted against a vast and expansive landscape. But John, even near the end of his life, knew the paintings only from reproductions. He'd never actually seen one. So when the Chicago Art Institute announced a small Friedrich exhibition, I was determined to take John to see it. It was his last trip. We were both thrilled by the Friedrich show. It was impossible not to see John in those lone figures gazing out into the distant landscape. When he died in 1994, as Dawson told you earlier, he left the Watzek House, the building in San Francisco, the art collection, and indirectly the Jorgensen House to me, and the Shire to a charitable trust with me as trustee, along with two others. His brother Norman urged me to sell the Watzek House and start a new life, and let John rest in peace. But I felt a deep responsibility to protect both the house and the Shire. The house has nearly all of its original fixtures and finishes. And I kept thinking of a prominent couple in town who had told me early on that they had seriously considered buying the Watzek House. And one of them said, quote, "If we had bought that house, the first thing we would have done would be paint out all of that wood in the living room and hallway." And he meant it. They actually bought Margaret Cabell's big house near the town club, and sure enough, the first thing they did was paint every visible indoor surface white. After exploring several possibilities, I decided to give the house and the Shire, plus a substantial endowment, to the University of Oregon School of Architecture and Allied Arts. It seemed to make sense, since the school has departments of both architecture and landscape architecture, plus the only program of historic preservation on the West Coast. The master agreement, signed by then President Dave Frohnmeyer, reads in part, "Through two outstanding achievements of John Yeon, the Watzek House and the Shire, the University of Oregon seeks to perpetuate his heritage and to provide support for research and education in architecture of the Pacific Northwest, historic preservation, art and architectural history, and landscape ecology and preservation. The foremost goal of the agreement and the university's overriding responsibility will be the faithful preservation and meticulous maintenance of the Watzek House and Shire in perpetuity." Now, my hope is that people like you, who are mostly younger than I am, will keep an eye on the properties in the years ahead and help the university out if needed, and stir up a fuss if things ever seem to be slipping. Now, I want to talk briefly about a pair of Japanese screens. There was an image earlier on the screen here, and they're in the exhibition, to illustrate how intensely John investigated and championed many of his possessions. He bought the screens in Osaka in 1959. The dealer dated them 15th century, and John came to believe that they were by Sesshu, a 15th century Zen priest who is generally regarded as Japan's greatest painter. Trying to prove that the screens were by Sesshu was, in John's words, the equivalent of trying to prove they were by Michelangelo. He sent out large mounted photos and a 4-page single-spaced polemic, a tightly reasoned analysis of all known and published Seshu screens. He sent a copy to his friend Larry Sigmund with a note saying, "See, I'm a Kunsthistorischer. I only wish I could persuade others as thoroughly as I have persuaded myself. By now I'm convinced that my screens are not only by Seshu, lui-même, but possibly the best surviving pair. I really and truly do prefer them to any others, although I can't effectively say why. Nothing can be subtracted from them without a loss, whereas all the others could stand some pruning. But that isn't it. Could it be because they're mine? Oh no," he wrote. Now, with the clear expectation that someday, long after I'm gone, some scholar is going to come along and, eureka, discover an unknown pair of Seshu screens right here in River City, I hereby offer them for the permanent collection of the museum to be added to the John Yeon collection, gift of Richard Lewis Brown. And while I'm in a giving mood, a year or so, Mary Beth Graybill, less than diplomatically perhaps, sent me a message listing 25 Korean objects in order of preference that she would like to have for the collection. Very subtle. Well, they're all in the exhibition, and I don't know, but I guess they might as well stay here. I offer them with 3 exceptions, and again to be added to the museum's John Yeon collection. Now, over and over again, John demonstrated an unusual emphasis on ownership or possession. He almost never gave anything away. He felt as close to the objects in the vault as to the ones on view at any moment. He wrote, quote, "My Chinese soul responds to the remark, the past owner of a Chinese garden seldom lived in it, and only occasionally paid it a visit. People seem surprised that I spend so little time at the Shire or the beach. I enjoy them in absentia all the time, and the more so when I'm there because of so much absentia." Now, years after his death, I came across an unmarked brown envelope with a letter to me inside, a letter that was never delivered, and the message was devastating. Together we had seen the terracotta bust of a child by Paju in a sale, and both were attracted to it. As sometimes happened, it worked out that I bought the sculpture instead of John. We treated it as part of the collection and displayed it in the guest room. John photographed it lovingly from various angles. And at some point, I must have made an offhand quip about selling it to fund who knows what indulgence. I have no recollection of it. And he must have known that I never would have done that. Still, it triggered that possession obsession in John's head. And the letter that I found was really bitter. It was full of resentment that I owned the bust when it should have been his. The letter said I would regret it someday. Well, right about that. Geez, if I had known, if I'd had the slightest inkling that he felt that way, I would have given it to him in a heartbeat. I wept. I shoved the damn letter in the shredder. Well, John's long gone. But then in preparing this talk, I had an idea. Maybe it's not too late to say, here, it's yours. A feeble gesture, to be sure, but I hereby offer the Paju bust for the permanent collection of the Portland Art Museum to bear the credit line, the John Yeon collection. Among John's most treasured local friends were Aubrey Morgan and his wife Constance Morrow Morgan, who lived on a farm near Ridgefield, Washington. She was the sister of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, which is how John became acquainted with Charles Lindbergh. The Lindberghs stayed twice at one of John's little beach houses, and he was eager to show Charles the Shire, and if possible, interest him in the effort to protect the gorge. Alas, the appointed day was misty with little visibility, and John was deeply disappointed that things weren't going well at all. But just as they were about to leave, the clouds parted, and there in the clearing sky was a pair of eagles soaring in wide circles overhead, and for John at least, the day was saved. He used to say after 40, it's patch, pat, patch. Well, actually he stayed robust until 78, when he fell off a roof and shattered his right ankle. And what was he doing on that roof? Pruning a chinkapin tree. But it was the beginning of a long descent into heart failure. Although he was walking with difficulty, he still enjoyed meeting guests at the Shire. I had a photograph to show you with Arlene Schnitzer, of whom he was very fond. When we were there, it was a gorgeous day, but there were mosquitoes out in force. And they were particularly irksome to Harold, who lamented, "They really go for this kosher meat." John's last visit to the Shire was on a warm day in August 1992. We walked down to the narrow beach just where the little stream flows out and merges with the mighty river. I helped him take off his clothes, and he sat briefly in the shallow water, thinking. He died the following March at age 83. It was a Sunday afternoon. It was just the two of us at the Watzek house, and his last words were gallant and loving. The next Sunday, at about the same time of day, a great blue heron landed on the fountain in the courtyard pool. We stared at each other for a brief, magical moment before he spread his magnificent wings and flew away. I hope that you will remember that we had a quiet genius in our shared history who thought deeply, cared passionately, and worked ceaselessly to add beauty and to preserve the beauty of the Northwest. He read somewhere that prehistoric burial mounds had been found with evidence that bunches of gathered flowers had been laid by the dead. It touched him profoundly to think that even then, tribute was paid with objects of simple, natural beauty. He believed that beauty lifts us up. It makes life better. It makes us better. The search for beauty transcends our differences and binds us together in our humanity. And so does the search for love. Thank you for listening.